What if the people you love most are quietly asking you to erase yourself piece by piece? Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But what happens when the people closest to you need you to be someone else entirely? Here are 5 requests that sound like love but feel like slow suffocation. Let me tell you about Tina. She's 32, works in marketing, and everyone calls her the reliable one. Last Tuesday, her phone buzzed at 11 p.m. Her brother again. His car broke down. Again. Could she pick him up? She said yes, like she always does. But as she drove through empty streets, something twisted in her chest. When did helping become this? When did her kindness become his expectation? This is where it starts, in the space between caring and carrying, between being needed and being used. The first toxic request: carrying burdens that don't belong to you. Here's what nobody tells you about empathy: it has a shadow. Carl Jung's psychology teaches us that every strength, when taken too far, becomes its own prison. Your ability to feel others' pain. It's beautiful, but when you start carrying their emotional weight as if it's yours, you're not helping them, you're enabling them. You know this feeling. Someone shares their problem and suddenly it lives in your chest like a stone. You lose sleep over their choices. You feel guilty for their consequences. You become more invested in their healing than they are. Mia learned this the hard way. For 3 years, she carried her best friend's depression like it was her own. Every suicide joke, every midnight crisis call, every canceled plan. Mia absorbed it all. She thought she was being loyal. She thought she was being loving. But Jung understood something crucial. Your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it. Mia's barrier wasn't cruelty. It was the belief that love meant suffering for someone else. One day, Mia's therapist asked her a question that changed everything. What would happen if you stopped being more committed to their healing than they are? The silence that followed was deafening. Because here's the shadow truth. When you carry someone else's burden, you rob them of their power to carry it themselves. You become the emotional caretaker, and they become the eternal patient. It's not love, it's codependency dressed up as compassion. Jung called this projection, where you unconsciously take on roles that don't belong to you. The helper, the fixer, the one who can't say no. You think you're being kind, but you're actually being controlled by your fear of being seen as heartless. Every time you say yes when your soul is screaming no, you teach people that your boundaries don't matter. You teach them that your peace is negotiable. You teach them that you exist to serve their comfort. And slowly, quietly, you disappear. The second toxic request: lending money when it's not really urgent. Let's talk about money. Not the numbers in your bank account, but what money represents to your psyche: security, control, self-worth, the fruits of your labor. When someone asks you to lend money, especially when it's not truly urgent, they're not just asking for cash. They're asking you to sacrifice your sense of safety for their convenience. Paul knows this intimately. He's lent money to friends 17 times in the past 2 years. Small amounts, he tells himself. 50 here, 100 there. But it adds up. More than the money, it's the pattern that's eating at him. I'll pay you back Friday, they say. Friday becomes next month. Next month becomes when things settle down. Meanwhile, Paul is calculating every coffee purchase, every grocery trip, wondering if he can afford his own life while subsidizing theirs. But here's where Carl Jung psychology gets interesting. Paul isn't just being generous. He's compensating for a wound. Deep down, he's afraid of being seen as stingy, selfish, or worse, not good enough to deserve keeping what he's earned. This is shadow work territory. The part of you that gives when you can't afford to give is the same part that believes your worth is tied to your usefulness. It's the part that whispers, if you don't help them, they won't love you. Jung would call this the false helper archetype, where you perform generosity to avoid the terror of being ordinary, of being just another person who sometimes says no. The painful truth: when you lend money, you can't afford to lose. You're not helping anyone. You're teaching them that your financial boundaries are negotiable. You're teaching them that their wants are more important than your needs. And you're teaching yourself that love is transactional. Real love doesn't ask you to compromise your security. Real love doesn't put you in the position of choosing between their comfort and your peace of mind. The third toxic request: being dragged into family conflict. Family. The word alone can make you feel 8 years old again, can't it? There's something about family conflict that bypasses all your adult reasoning and drops you right back into childhood patterns you thought you'd outgrown. Let me introduce you to Jim. He's 28 lives, 3 states away from his parents, has his own life, his own problems. But every few months his phone rings, and suddenly he's the mediator in his parents' marriage. Again. Can you talk to your father? He won't listen to me. Your mother is being impossible. Maybe she'll hear it from you. And Jim, who can negotiate million-dollar deals at work, becomes a frightened child trying to keep his family together. This is what Carl Jung psychology calls the family savior complex, an unconscious role assignment that probably started before you could even speak. Someone in the family system gets tagged as the emotional referee, the peacekeeper, the one who fixes things. And once that role is yours, the family will unconsciously conspire to keep you in it. Here's what's really happening. Your family isn't asking for your help. They're asking you to manage their inability to have difficult conversations with each other. They're using you as an emotional middleman to avoid the discomfort of direct conflict resolution. But every time you step into that referee position, you lose a piece of yourself. You become responsible for emotions that aren't yours, for relationships that don't belong to you, for outcomes you can't control. Jim's breakthrough came during a particularly brutal family crisis. His parents were threatening divorce again, and both sides were calling him, demanding he choose sides. For the first time in his life, Jim said, "This is between you two. I love you both, but I'm not your marriage counselor." The silence on the other end was thunderous. His mother cried. His father got angry. They both accused him of abandoning the family. And Jim felt something he'd never felt before, the weight of their emotional chaos lifting off his shoulders. Because here's the shadow truth about family saviors. The more you rescue, the less capable they become of rescuing themselves. The more you mediate, the less they learn to communicate directly. You think you're keeping the family together, but you're actually enabling their dysfunction. Jung understood this perfectly. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Your family's inability to accept their own conflicts, their own responsibility, their own growth. That's their journey. When you try to shortcut their pain, you rob them of their power to transcend it. But here's where this gets really uncomfortable. What if your role as the family savior isn't just about helping them? What if it's about the secret power you feel when you're indispensable? What if part of you likes being needed even when it's destroying you? This is the shadow's shadow. the part of you that thrives on being the solution to everyone else's problems, because it gives you a sense of identity, of purpose, of control. Remove the chaos, and who are you? Stay with me. This is where the real healing begins. The fourth request cuts even deeper. The fourth toxic request: being told to change yourself. You're too sensitive. You think too much. Why can't you just let things go? You're being dramatic. That's just how they are. You need to adjust. These phrases might sound familiar. They should. They're the language of emotional erasure wrapped in the guise of helpful advice. Let me tell you about Zoe. She's an artist, deeply intuitive, feels everything intensely. Her family has spent 30 years trying to tone her down. Zoe's having one of her moments again. Zoe needs to toughen up. Zoe takes everything too personally. By age 30, Zoe had become a master of emotional camouflage. She learned to laugh when she wanted to cry, to minimize when she wanted to express, to apologize for feeling what she felt. She thought she was becoming more mature. Really, she was becoming more invisible. This is where Carl Jung psychology becomes revolutionary. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is being who you are, not who they need you to be, not who they're comfortable with, who you actually are in all your messy, intense, complicated humanity." When someone asks you to change your essential nature, your sensitivity, your passion, your way of processing the world, they're not asking for your growth. They're asking for your erasure. They're asking you to become smaller so they can feel bigger. They're asking you to dim your light so they don't have to confront their own darkness. This is a direct attack on what Jung called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you're meant to be. Every time you edit yourself to fit someone else's comfort zone, you move further away from your authentic self. You trade your soul for their approval. Zoe's turning point came when her therapist asked her, "What if your sensitivity isn't something to fix? What if it's your superpower and they're threatened by it?" The room went quiet. For the first time, Zoe considered that maybe she wasn't too much. Maybe they were just too little. Maybe her intensity wasn't a flaw. Maybe it was a gift they couldn't handle. Jung understood this. Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens. Zoe started looking inside. She stopped apologizing for her tears, her depth, her way of loving fiercely. She stopped shrinking. And yes, some people were uncomfortable. But the ones who truly loved her, they celebrated her return to herself. Because here's the truth. They don't want you to know. You're not too much. You never were. You're exactly the right amount of yourself. And anyone who asks you to be less is telling you more about their limitations than yours. The fifth toxic request: putting their emotions above yours. This one is subtle, so subtle you might not even recognize it's happening. It sounds like care, looks like consideration, feels like love, but it's actually the most insidious form of emotional manipulation. "I can't handle stress right now, so don't tell me about your problems. You know how upset I get when you're sad. Can you try to be more positive around me? I've had a rough day, so let's not make this about you." These statements have a common thread. They position their emotional stability as more important than your emotional expression. They create a hierarchy where your feelings exist only in service of their comfort. Meet Rachel. She's been married for 8 years to someone who has mastered this art. Whenever Rachel tries to share something difficult, stress at work, anxiety about her health, sadness about her father's illness, Her husband's response is predictable. "You're bringing me down. Can we talk about this later when you're feeling better?" Later never comes. Rachel has learned to perform emotional stability. She saves her tears for the shower, her fears for her journal, her authentic self for nowhere. She exists in a state of constant emotional caretaking, managing not just her own feelings, but curating them for his consumption. This is what Jung called emotional servitude, where you become responsible for managing someone else's emotional experience at the expense of your own. You become a mood manager, an atmosphere controller, an emotional servant. Here's what's happening in the shadow. The person making this request has never learned to regulate their own emotions. Instead of developing inner resilience, they've learned to control their environment by controlling you. Your authenticity threatens their fragile emotional ecosystem, so they've trained you to perform a version of yourself that keeps them comfortable. Carl Jung psychology teaches us about emotional boundaries, the sacred space where your feelings belong to you and you alone. When someone asks you to suppress your emotions to preserve theirs, they're violating this fundamental boundary. They're asking you to sacrifice your inner truth for their outer peace. Rachel's awakening came gradually. She started noticing the pattern. How she would edit her words before speaking. How she would check his mood before sharing hers. How she had become more concerned with his emotional state than her own. The day she realized she had been apologizing for feeling sad about her father's cancer diagnosis was the day something shifted. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Where had she gone? When had she learned to disappear so completely? That night she told her husband about her fear, her grief, her need for support. When he responded with his usual deflection, "I can't handle this right now," she said something new. "I'm not asking you to handle it. I'm asking you to witness it. This is what loving someone looks like." The silence that followed was profound. Not comfortable, but profound. Because here's what emotional servitude really costs you: your relationship with yourself. When you constantly prioritize someone else's emotional comfort over your own emotional truth, you lose the ability to trust your own feelings. You become a stranger to yourself, living in service to someone else's psychological limitations. Jung said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." What if their inability to handle your emotions isn't about you being too much? What if it's about them being too little, too fragile, too unwilling to grow? You deserve to be loved in your entirety, not just the parts that are easy to digest. You deserve relationships where your emotions are witnessed, not managed, where your authenticity is celebrated, not sanitized. Let's go deeper. Why do you accept these toxic requests? Why do you carry burdens that aren't yours? Lend money you can't afford to lose. Mediate conflicts that don't belong to you. Change yourself to fit others' comfort zones and suppress your emotions to manage theirs. Carl Jung psychology has an answer. The shadow. Your shadow contains all the parts of yourself you've learned to disown, to hide, to be ashamed of. For most people, this includes the part of you that says no, that has boundaries, that puts yourself first sometimes. You've been taught that these qualities are selfish, mean, unloving. So you've exiled them to the shadow. And now you live in terror of being seen as someone who doesn't care enough, who doesn't give enough, who isn't good enough. You've confused selflessness with love boundaries, with cruelty, self-care, with selfishness. But here's what Jung understood, that most people miss. Your shadow isn't your enemy. It's your missing piece. The part of you that knows how to say no isn't mean, it's wise. The part of you that protects your resources isn't selfish, it's responsible. The part of you that refuses to carry others' emotional weight isn't heartless, it's healthy. Think about Jim, the family mediator. His shadow contained his ability to let others handle their own problems. He was terrified of being seen as uncaring, so he carried everyone's emotional burdens until he disappeared under their weight. Think about Zoe, who changed herself to fit others' comfort zones. Her shadow contained her right to take up space exactly as she was. She was terrified of being rejected, so she became so accommodating that she lost herself entirely. Think about Rachel, who suppressed her emotions to manage her husband's comfort. Her shadow contained her right to feel everything fully. She was terrified of being too much, so she became too little. The shadow work isn't about becoming selfish. It's about becoming whole. It's about integrating the parts of yourself you've been taught to fear and discovering that they're not dark at all. They're just different from what you were told was acceptable. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Your darkness isn't your cruelty. It's your boundaries. It's your self-respect. It's your refusal to disappear for someone else's comfort. When you start to integrate your shadow, something magical happens. You stop being afraid of being disliked. You stop confusing love with approval. You stop believing that your worth is tied to your usefulness. You start to understand that real love doesn't ask you to become smaller. Real love doesn't ask you to carry what isn't yours. Real love doesn't ask you to suppress your truth. Real love sees you, all of you, and says, "Yes, that one, exactly as you are." Tina, who used to drop everything for her brother's emergencies, learned to say, "I love you and I trust you to handle this." The first time she said it, her heart pounded. She was sure he would hate her. Instead, something unexpected happened. He figured it out, and their relationship became more authentic, more equal, more loving. Paul, who used to lend money he couldn't afford, learned to say, "I care about you, and I can't compromise my financial security." The friends who truly cared understood. The ones who didn't, well, that told him everything he needed to know. This isn't about becoming cold or uncaring. It's about caring in a way that doesn't require you to disappear. It's about loving in a way that includes loving yourself. So here they are, the 5 requests that sound like love, but feel like slow suffocation, carrying burdens that don't belong to you, where you become more invested in their problems than they are, lending money when it's not really urgent, where your security becomes negotiable for their convenience, being dragged into family conflict, where you become the emotional referee for relationships that aren't yours, being told to change yourself, where your authenticity becomes a threat to their comfort, putting their emotions above yours, where you become responsible for managing their inner world at the expense of your own. Each of these requests has a shadow truth. They're only possible when you're afraid. Afraid of being abandoned. Afraid of being disliked. Afraid of being seen as not good enough. Afraid of being alone. But Carl Jung psychology teaches us something revolutionary. The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. The very thing you're afraid of being disliked for having boundaries is actually the doorway to authentic love. When you stop carrying others' burdens, you give them back their power. When you stop lending money, you can't afford, you model healthy boundaries. When you step out of family conflicts, you force them to learn direct communication. When you refuse to change yourself, you give others permission to be authentic too. When you honor your emotions, you create space for real intimacy. This isn't about becoming selfish. This is about becoming whole. This is about remembering that you are not a supporting character in other people's stories. You are the author of your own. Jung said, "Your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it." The barrier isn't your boundaries. The barrier is your belief that love requires you to disappear. Every time you say no when your soul wants to say no, you come home to yourself a little more. Every time you choose your peace over their comfort, you remember who you are beneath all the roles you've been playing. This is shadow work. This is individuation. This is the journey from performing love to actually receiving it. You don't have to become a smaller version of yourself just to keep others comfortable. You never did. That was just fear talking, convincing you that you weren't lovable as you actually are. The moment you stop performing empathy is the moment you start receiving it. The moment you stop earning love is the moment you remember you already have it. The moment you stop disappearing is the moment you finally fully appear. So here's my invitation to you. Comment awake. If you're ready to choose yourself, share which of these 5 truths hit closest to home, because somewhere out there is someone who needs to hear that it's okay to take up space, to have boundaries, to be authentically, unapologetically themselves. Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not who they need you to be, who you actually are." The world doesn't need another people pleaser. It needs you. Real, authentic, bounded whole you. Welcome home to yourself.